Hello, my name is Robert Pembroke. I thought I'd tell you today about the life and sort of times biography of Irving Goffman, both in terms of his scholarly work and his life, his personal life. Irving Goffman, Irving, by the way, the given name is spelt, I do believe, with an I in the English rather than an E by convention, but there's no need to change it. Everyone knows what it is. Yeah. Some people do spell it that way. Irving Goffman wrote the rather seminal work Asylums in 1961. It was written at a time when there was quite an attitudinal tendency towards an aversion to the clinical model, the therapeutic relationship. It was typified in the self-analysis of R.D. Laing in his text, The Divided Self. He himself, he never said he disagreed with the medical model, but he was largely aligned with the anti-psychiatry movement. And you can sort of get the idea that Mr Goffman, he was part of this groundswell, this tide of resentment that was developing against disciplinary regime in the Faculty of Medicine that involuntarily detained people without charge quite frequently on the hearsay of people who were rather dubious themselves. And they would conduct involuntary electroshock therapy, and there was always a threat of lobotomy hanging over people's heads, and this led to texts such as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which became a movie starring the wonderful Jack Nicholson. Wonderful actor, eh? So Mr Goffman develops his narrative in relation to asylums with that atmosphere occurring at the time within society. He'd been largely influenced by the work of Bloomer, Durkheim, Emil Durkheim, who himself was largely believed to be the father of the theory of suicide. He developed an idea about how suicide occurs. And there was, of course, his enchantment, Mr Goffman's enchantment with the work of one Sigmund Freud, whose psychoanalytic approach attempted to link up deviancy with sexual practices. Again, Radcliffe-Brown, famous anthropologist, of note, who'd studied tribes both here in Australia and the Pacific, and influenced such wonderfully erudite thinkers as Claude Levi-Strauss, the famous anthropological structuralist. There was, of course, at the time, and still today even, an enchantment over the idea of the analysis of power and the work of one Talcott Parsons, who developed ideas about how power diffuses within networks of people in human society. Okay, so Asylums, it's published in 1961. He'd had some experience with people with mental illness. He himself had a lot of problems, and his wife Angelica, she'd had quite a turbulent history, family history, with her family who'd had a history of mental illness as well, and she was periodically institutionalised, and this is how Mr Goffman himself got dragged into the modality of incarceration within psychiatry too. Angelica had an ambivalent relationship with her family, became quite contentious, and it spilled over into her relationship with Mr Goffman. And she committed suicide, unfortunately, in 1964. The strange thing about this story is that Irving Goffman publishes Asylums in 1961, and his wife commits suicide in 1964. And the interesting thing about it is that in that time between the late 1960s and 1964, Angelica was forced to see psychiatrists. Okay, I'll just offer an errata here, by way of corollary. Yeah, the period of time I'm referring to is from the late 1950s to approximately 1964, when Angelica commits suicide. Not the late 1960s, because it's all over with by then. I don't believe Mr Goffman would have received approval from either the University of Toronto nor the University of Chicago for his what in sociology is termed a participant observation, and in psychology is termed a natural observation. I don't think so, because he's actually an experiential human subject. He's actually in there for treatment rather than to conduct a study, but that's what he ends up doing. Now this contrasts with, say, the work of Philip Zimbardo in relation to the Stanford prison experiment of the 1970s, where Mr Zimbardo receives approval from the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps to conduct the prison experiment. He's not actually excuse me, he's not actually building a prison. He's sort of making an artificial one, yeah? And he has participants in it, and he actually pays them, they get paid for that. And they had to abandon the experiment because it got out of hand and people became psychotic. So there's somewhat of a difference between the situation of Mr Goffman and the situation that is imposed by departments in relation to the Stanford experiment. And what this means is that there was a point where Mr Goffman published Asylum in 1961 and his wife committed suicide in 1964, where he could have abandoned the therapeutic relationship with the medical model, with the hospital, if indeed he was allowed to. Because a lot of people can't. They're like a captive audience within the therapeutic relationship. Okay, so it may have been the case that Mr Goffman couldn't extricate himself from that situation, and it accumulated into a problem where his wife committed suicide. He himself was involuntarily detained, incarcerated, prior to her suicide, yeah? Because the text Asylum was published in 1961, okay? This is something people don't wish to tell other people, isn't it? Yes, so there's this rather turbid sort of atmosphere occurring in his life, and that's how he is motivated to write on the nature of the anti-psychiatry thought that develops in relation to what is a conflicting a situation of conflict. Yeah. I won't go into it deeply. If you want to read the text, it's up to you. I will tell you though that there's kind of like two steps in the process of incarceration. You have this divestment of clothing where the person is stripped of their clothing, and the funny thing is that there must be an association there between identity and clothing for them to remove people's clothing. Yeah? They'll even remove your valuables like the money in your wallet and your identity cards and everything. So you can actually go missing in a psychiatric hospital and no one would know who the heck you were. It's probably someone there. In fact, there have been situations where this has occurred within the Queensland prison system, believe it or not. Yeah, so he's sort of dragged into it. He has no choice. He's sitting there, and like Robinson Crusoe in Daniel Defoe's novel about the solitary human being shipwrecked on an island, Mr Goffman commences to write down schedules of behaviour, like lists. You know how Robinson Crusoe, he writes lists, yeah, of chores he has to do, of what he has to do, his scheduling, he has a list. Mr Goffman commences to do the same thing. He starts to develop schedules of behaviour that occur within the institution. And that's how he analyses it. So you have this divestment of clothing, that's something he noted, and then you have this imposition of a regime of drugs, medication. Now the idea behind this is one, you strip the identity, and then two, you impose a regime of heavy drug use on the client. And the drugs are known to desensitise the person to suggestion. One has led to model the behaviour of other people. And that's how psychiatrists impose the nature of prognoses within institutional settings. And it's a type of mirroring that occurs, a bit like a drunk. You know, when a person gets drunk, you can tell them anything, they'll believe anything, won't they? Yeah? It's a bit like that. They heavily drug the person, and then they get these people to go around them doing things, yeah, who are equally drugged. And it's kind of like a modelling and mirroring effect that occurs, yeah? And what then happens is a type of prognosis is imposed. And if you don't have a diagnosis of a condition in DSM-5 when you go in there, you definitely will by the time you get out, because that's the whole idea. The idea is to impose a prognosis. So it's a rather strange world, isn't it? The world that Mr Goffman lived in, and myself as well. There's a lot of us who have had to endure this process. And one must ask, you know, what is the bona fides of the people who do these things, yeah? Anyway, thanks very much. Oh, I thought I'd sing for you Old Sid that was sung by Daryl Braithwaite, yeah? Because I love that song, it's wonderful, isn't it? I'll get someone on the piano, robot piano.
How sweet it is. Gandalf.
Oh, sorry I'm late, Mr Gandalf. Has anybody seen old Sid around? Maybe you've seen him near the ground, in a park bench by the sea. Has anybody seen old Sid? Has anybody seen old Sid? Has anybody seen old Sid around? Maybe you've seen him in your town. He'll be joking, messing around. He's that clown who's got that frown. Oh, he's that king without a crown. Oh, has anybody seen old Sid around? Maybe you've seen him on the ground, in a park bench near the sea. Has anybody seen old Sid? Has anybody seen old Sid? Has anybody seen old Sid around? In a bar or on the street, you remember him when we meet. Has anybody seen old old Sid around. Maybe you'll sing him in your town. In that park bench near the sea. Has anybody seen old Sid? Has anybody seen old Sid? Has anybody seen old Sid? Has anybody seen? Has anybody seen my old man? Thanks everybody, cheers.